The Process Podcast, breaking down the daily habits, processes, and tools of high achievers. Now, here's your host, Brad Wilson.
Hey there, everybody. I'm Brad Wilson, host of the Process Podcast. If you haven't yet subscribed to the show, please take a second to hit that little subscribe button to make sure that you'll never miss any of the amazing value my guests share about their personal processes. And if you would like a list of 5 projects and daily actions that will provide massive benefit with very little risk, as well as a resource pack to help you get started, head on over to mentallyinvincible.com and join my email newsletter. The format of today's show is a little different from normal and stems directly from episode 19 of the Process Podcast with author Victoria Schwab, who told me that one of the most important things she does to improve her craft is to get out of her lane and read books in all different genres. Effectively, this deepens the creative well from which she draws. Ever since the release of the episode with Victoria Schwab, I've actively searched out podcasts that follow different formats from my own. And quite frankly, I've been blown out of the water. 2 of my favorites are Lore and Philosophize This, and I now consume each of them every single week. I've discovered that when you're listening, reading, or watching things from the perspective of a learner and not just as a consumer, doors have this way of magically opening that you otherwise would never have noticed. With all of that being said, today is going to be my first foray into story-driven episodes that are woven together by a simple thread. They give me hope for the future of humanity. When the waves of dread sweep over me, I try to keep these stories at the forefront of my mind because I find that they give my heart solace. If you rely solely on the media and the news for your information, hope can be a hard commodity to find. We log onto our computers and are instantly punched in the face with tragedy. Pittsburgh Synagogue, #MeToo, Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, global warming. All of these are avoidable, man-made pain and suffering. Sometimes when I consider the systems and processes of the world that generate hate, viciousness, and greed, they appear to me as massive, unstoppable harbingers of the apocalypse. In the face of such unchangeable entities, dark and hopeless roots start growing in my mind. I find myself in a simulation of a not-so-distant future where, of our own doing, humanity no longer exists in this universe. And as I inhabit this future world, I start meditating on a fundamental question that almost seems too horrible to utter out loud. Is the universe better off without us? We're capable of torture, murder, and rape. We're masters of manipulation and often exploit one another on a moment's notice. We displace and destroy the creatures we should be sharing our planet with. We face a looming existential threat in the form of man-made climate change, and we distort the truth, insanely driven by maintaining and increasing profits. It's easy to feel small, powerless, and overwhelmed while living in such a world. But there are stories that also exist that show the opposite end of the spectrum. Positive stories, optimistic stories. Stories of human beings whose goodness burns so incredibly bright that they became stars in our hearts, living there for thousands of years as examples of humanity's greatness. These stories serve as reminders for humanity's capacity for love and provide evidence of the tragic loss the universe would experience if one day we did not exist. So today, I'd first like to share an ancient story of hope, which provides valuable insight and context into the mind and spirit of the man whose life and actions are at the center of this episode. Thousands of years ago, in one of the Buddha's previous lives, he was born into a wealthy and mighty family. Naturally, innately, the Buddha was a fast learner, and as a child, he had already mastered the 18 branches of science and all of the arts. Since he was born into an affluent family, he began making a name for himself at a very early age. If his life would have occurred in 2018, his name would have had a blue check mark next to it on social media, and we'd all be following his every tweet. The ancient Buddhist texts state his authority as a young man as such. To the Brahmins, his family, he was like the Holy Writ. To the Kshatriyas, the ruling and military class, as venerable as a king. To the masses, he appeared like the embodied thousand-eyed one, which is the Buddhist deity who perceives the world's cries. And to those who long for knowledge, he was a helpful father. He was wealthy, famous, and respected, but these attributes held no weight to the Buddha. As the texts tell us, he would eventually renounce all of his physical possessions and withdraw to some plateau. And since there was no Twitter or Instagram at the time, the people who loved and adored the Buddha had to follow him in a very primitive way, physically. These acolytes were his actual followers who became his disciples. With the Buddha as their teacher, it's said that most of these disciples reached perfection or enlightenment, nirvana. It's also said in the ancient Buddhist texts that, quote, his calmness, full of friendliness, spread about, it seems, and penetrated into the hearts of the ferocious animals, so as to make them cease injuring one another and live like ascetics, a person who practices severe self-discipline and abstention, monks, essentially. By dint of the pureness of his conduct, his self-control, his contentment, and his compassion, he was no less a friend even to the people in the world, who were unknown to him, than all creatures were friends to him. End quote. One day, the Buddha was hiking through the mountains with one of his disciples, Ajita, at his side. During their hike, the duo happened upon a clearing with the view of a cavern far below. In the cavern, they could see a young tigress with her cubs. She had sunken eyes and an emaciated belly. She was clearly in pain and starving to death. When her little cubs approached the tigress for nourishment, she would roar, lunge, and angrily push them away. She had no extra energy to exert or strength left to give. The tigress's only option for survival would be to eat her cubs. On seeing the tigress, the Buddha was consumed with compassion by the suffering of his fellow creature. He immediately instructed Ajita to search for food to ease the mother's hunger while he would do the same. The disciple promised to obey and quickly disappeared into the brush. Before I continue on with the tale, I'd first like you to imagine yourself in this situation. What would be your gut reaction? Would you frantically search for meat for the mother? Would you climb down the treacherous cliff face, rescue the cubs, and raise them yourself? Would you be impassive like a nature photographer and simply let nature take its course? And now I'd like you to probe a little deeper into the depths of your being. With your choice in mind, ask yourself why you're the type of person who would make this specific choice. What is your reason, your why? What events in your life have predetermined your action at this pivotal fork in the road? I ask you this for a very simple purpose. I believe the internal process which drives our decisions is ultimately what ends up defining our lives. When faced with multiple forks in the road, our personal why is what makes one option more appealing than the rest. It's also what gives us clarity in taking the actions that allow our souls to breathe. It's at this point in our story that the Buddha chose his path. He walked to the edge of the overpass, and he leapt off. The Buddha knew he had only one choice available that would preserve the life of the tigress and her cubs, and that was by giving away his own flesh as sustenance. Ajita, returning to his master without having found any meat, looked down on the hungry tigress feeding on the body of the Buddha and exclaimed, quote, "Oh, how merciful the great-eyed one was to people afflicted by distress. How indifferent he was to his own welfare. How he has brought to perfection the virtuous conduct of the pious and dashed to pieces the splendid glory of their adversaries. How he has displayed, clinging to virtues, his heroic, fearless, and immense love." End quote. Whether you believe this story about the Buddha is true or not, it's hard to ignore the compassion that the ancient texts in Buddhism teach in regards to the lives of all sentient beings on the planet. And it's also hard to deny the hope it inspires when considering the seemingly endless capacity in which human beings are capable of love. The Buddha's decision on that day ultimately created lessons and philosophies upon which millions of human beings build the foundation of their entire life. The wisdom of his actions was passed down generation after generation for thousands and thousands of years. If he had simply walked away, an opportunity to share a lesson for thousands of years would have been lost. As the Vulcan Spock would say, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. And yes, a large part of me believes that if I jumped off a cliff to save a mother tiger, it would assuredly be kept a secret between me and the tiger family, and I'm almost certain they wouldn't be telling anybody. It's easy to see ourselves as very small people in comparison to the great heroes of history. Who are we to make a gigantic change in such a corrupt and greedy world? You and I may only be non-godlike humans, but then again, so is he. Lam Van Tuck was born in the village of Hoi Con in central Vietnam as one of 7 children in 1897. At the age of 7, he left to study Buddhism under his maternal uncle and spiritual master, Quang Tam. At 15, he took the novice vows and was ordained as a monk at the age of 20, under the new name, Thich Quang Duc. After ordination, he traveled to a mountain near Ninh Hoa, vowing to live the life of a hermit for 3 years. Later in life, Duc would return to his mountain retreat to open the Tien Lok Pagoda, the first of 31 new temples he would ultimately be responsible for. His intention in life's work was to spend the rest of his days teaching and spreading the religion of the Buddha. On June 10, 1963, word off the wire was that something important was going to happen near the Cambodian embassy in Saigon. Journalists David Halberstam and Malcolm Brown arrived the next day. They were about to witness an act that would captivate the world. One unarmed, 66-year-old man was about to tip over the first in a long line of dominoes, initiating a chain of events ending a murderous and suppressive, decade-long regime that had single-handedly toppled a dynasty. When almost all of the authority in a nation is nestled in one place, it doesn't really matter what religion the majority of the people follow. The only thing that really matters is what the people at the top believe. In this case, a 70 to 90% Buddhist majority in South Vietnam was led by Catholic President Ngo Dinh Diem. President Diem had ruthlessly worked his way up the ladder of power after being chosen as Prime Minister by the 13th and final emperor of the Nguyen dynasty, Bao Day. Bao Day had originally chosen Diem as the Prime Minister for a very specific purpose: to fail spectacularly. You see, Diem was a threat to Bao Day, and in order to neutralize the threat, the president elevated Diem to Prime Minister in 1954 in the midst of a great political and economic crisis. Instead of failing spectacularly, Diem not only survived, but accumulated more influence and more authority day by day. 1 year after his promotion to Prime Minister, Diem called for a vote to remove Bao Day as emperor and establish a republic with Diem as the first president of South Vietnam. Diem won the referendum with a convincing 98% of the votes. As it turns out, he won with 380,000 more votes than there were registered voters. Despite the allegations of voter fraud, Bao Day could not campaign on his behalf as the sitting emperor, a quirk of the law that I have no doubt the new President Diem understood very well. Diem was politically savvy, and his influence would only grow. By the summer of 1963, Diem had survived 2 coup attempts and had toppled a dynasty. The muscle and brutality in Diem's regime was provided by his younger brother and chief political advisor, Ngo Dinh Nhu. Even though he had no official title, Ngo Dinh Nhu was the leader of both the ARVN, a 2,500-man Army of the Republic of Vietnam Special Forces. He also headed the Diem regime's secret police. Remember that 98% election number? The fraud had Ngo's fingerprints all over it. Between 1955 and 1958, 12,000 suspected opponents of Diem were killed and 40,000 political prisoners had been jailed. One other character in the Diem regime is worthy of mention, namely Madame Nu, the wife of No, distant cousin of Bao Dai, and First Lady of the Diem regime. As with every high-ranking official in the Diem regime, she was a convert to Roman Catholicism from Buddhism. Madame Nu was educated at a French school in Hanoi, the Lycée Albert Sarraut. Under France's educational policy at the time, it was intended to, quote, make all Vietnamese Frenchmen with yellow skin, end quote. It was otherwise known as the Civilizing Mission. Growing up, Madame Nu learned nothing about Vietnamese history. The geopolitical situation in the 60s was pretty cut and dry. You were either a communist or you were not. Because of the Buddhist majority's neutralism, they were seen by the political elite as communist collaborators. It was a classic example of the old creed, if you're not with us, you are against us. As a result, it's probably unsurprising to learn that during Diem's reign, a number of rights had been stripped away from the Buddhist population, including army officers were forced to convert to Catholicism if they wanted promotion, guns distributed to villages for self-defense militias were only issued to Catholics, some Roman Catholic priests paraded their own private armies around under the watchful eye of the Diem regime. These armies forced conversions, looted, shelled, and demolished Buddhist temples. The regime did nothing to protect the innocent. The white and gold Vatican flag was regularly flown at all major public events in South Vietnam, and in 1959, Diem dedicated his country to the Virgin Mary. The Roman Catholic Church was the largest landowner in the country. It enjoyed special exemptions in property acquisition, and land owned by the Roman Catholic Church was exempt from land reform. President Diem even informed his officers, not knowing that some of them had families who were practicing Buddhist, to, quote, put your Catholic officers in sensitive places. They can be trusted, end quote. On the 8th of May, during the celebration of Vesak, the celebration of the 2527th anniversary of the Buddha's birthday, violence erupted around the country. President Diem was furious about the celebrations, and despite flying a Catholic flag in commemoration of his older brother's elevation to bishop a few days earlier, he ordered the police to put Vesak celebrations under a law that forbade religious symbols from being paraded in the streets. Banning the flag led to mass protests, which were suppressed by Diem's forces. Several unarmed civilians were killed during the clashes. When Madame Nu later learned Diem was prepared to offer reparations to the families killed in the battles, she reportedly threw a bowl of soup at him. Of the act, John F. Kennedy would say, "No news picture in history has generated so much emotion around the world as that one." The scene would later be described as, "The spectators were mostly stunned into silence, but some wailed and several began praying. Many of the monks and nuns, as well as some shocked passerby, prostrated themselves before the monk. Even some of the policemen, who had orders to control the crowd, prostrated before him." On June 11, 1963, Thich Quang Duc arrived as part of a procession of 350 monks and nuns marching in two phalanxes, carrying banners printed in both English and Vietnamese. They denounced the Diem government and its policies towards Buddhists, demanding that it fulfill its promises of religious equality. Duc exited his car at a busy street in Saigon with two fellow monks. One placed a cushion on the road while the second opened the trunk and removed a 5-gallon gas can. The marchers formed a circle around him, while Duc calmly sat in the traditional lotus position on the cushion. One of the monks emptied the gas on his head. Duc rotated a string of wooden prayer beads and recited a prayer to the Buddha. Quote, "Before closing my eyes and moving towards the vision of the Buddha, I respectfully plead to President No Dinh Diem to take a mind of compassion towards the people of the nation and implement religious equality to maintain the strength of the homeland eternally. I call the venerables, reverends, members of the Sangha, and the lay Buddhists to organize in solidarity to make sacrifices to protect Buddhism," before striking a match and dropping it on himself. picture Malcolm Brown took of Thich Quang Duc setting himself ablaze appeared on the front page of newspapers in almost every country on the planet. In the face of the event, Madame Nu was quoted as saying, "I may shock some by saying I would beat such provocateurs 10 times more if they wore monk's robes, and I would clap my hands at seeing another monk barbecue show, for one cannot be responsible for the madness of others." 4 months after Thich Quang Duc's sacrifice, the Diem regime in the First Republic of Vietnam ceased to exist, overthrown by a coup which assassinated both Diem and his brother Nu. Madame Nu would be exiled for the rest of her life. Of the scene itself, I have gathered the following quotes. "I was to see that sight again, but once was enough. Flames were coming from a human being. His body was slowly withering and shriveling up, his head blackening and charring. In the air was the smell of burning human flesh. Human beings burned surprisingly quickly. Behind me, I could hear the sobbing of the Vietnamese who were now gathering. I was too shocked to cry, too confused to take notes or ask questions, too bewildered to even think. As he burned, he never moved a muscle, never uttered a sound, his outward composure in sharp contrast to the wailing people around him." End quote. David Halberstam, U.S. journalist and historian. Historian Seth Jenkins would later assert that Duc had, quote, "reduced America's Diem experiment to ashes as well, and that no amount of pleading could retrieve Diem's reputation once Brown's images had become ingrained into the psyche of the world public." John Mecklin, an official from the U.S. Embassy, noted that the photograph, quote, "had a shock effect of incalculable value to the Buddhist cause, becoming a symbol of the state of things in Vietnam." We regularly hear a common phrase throughout our lives. Is that how you want to spend your life? Our awareness, our consciousness is meant to be considered as a currency to be spent. In the stories of the Buddha and Thich Quang Duc, the last breath of their lives was spent deliberately on ideals much larger than themselves. The Buddha on compassion for all living things, and Thich Quang Duc as a peaceful protest in the face of seemingly insurmountable forces persecuting his people. I often imagine myself on my own deathbed, asking myself, how did I spend my life? This deathbed scenario is the why that drives the majority of all my actions in life. On the Philosophize This podcast, host Stephen West explains philosopher Michel Foucault's view of power as a thing that emanates not just from the top of the hierarchy, but from every single human being. It made me think about being a child in a grocery store and of the hundreds of times I left with bouncy balls that I very seriously doubt my mom had gone into the store intending to buy. It's easy to forget that this same power lies inside each and every one of us, and to think of ourselves as powerless in the face of the giant machines of the world. It's my opinion that the worthiest thing we can spend our life doing is to use our power to spread hope for the future prospects of humanity. Now, the release of this episode will be 3 days after the midterm elections in the United States. Whatever happens, whether your candidate wins or loses, remember that all is not hopeless. You still have inside you a vast amount of power. As well as voting on the ballot, you can vote every single day for the rest of your life with your actions. The onus is on us as individuals and singular human beings to speak up and take action when we observe evils that contradict our sense of justice, even and especially if your belief is not a popular thing, even if it feels uncomfortable or in some cases may be dangerous. It's in these moments on normal days, like all the other normal days, we're able to transcend ourselves and give much needed hope to the world. Now we're going to take a brief sponsored break before I conclude this experimental episode with 2 more quick, powerful stories about sacrifice that fill me to the brim with love and hope. Wait, what? So I'm getting word in from my producer that we currently don't have any sponsors. So if you love what we create here on the Process Podcast and you'd love to support us, here are a couple ways. The first thing you can do is head to our Patreon page and, well, become a patron of the Process Podcast at patreon.com/theprocesspodcast. Or you can email me directly at brad@mentallyinvincible.com to inquire about becoming a paid sponsor on the show. On September 19th, 2010, Brian Woods and his pregnant wife were driving along a road. An oncoming SUV lost control and swerved into their lane. Unable to prevent the crash, Brian slammed on the brakes and swerved his side of the car to the SUV. He was killed instantly. His wife and pregnant daughter survived. On July 2nd, 2013, high school sophomore Rebecca Townsend was out with her friend Benjamin watching fireworks. After the fireworks concluded at 9 p.m., they were crossing the street when a car drove towards them. Rebecca pushed Benjamin out of the way. She was hit by the car and later died. When her parents entered her bedroom sometime afterwards, they found a paper she had written for school 7 months earlier on her bed. She had been reading it the night she was killed. Go to Spain, kiss the rain, save a life. Her bucket list. As a final reminder, there is goodness, love, and hope all around us in the world. Every single one of you listening has a voice and power you can use to spread hope to the world. Let today be the day you start exerting that power. This episode of the Process Podcast was written and produced by Brad Wilson. It was edited by Carrie J. Donovan, found online at carriejdonovan.com. Special thanks to Ananda Jyoti of ancientbuddhatext.net for allowing the use of the English translated version of the story of the tigress in the show. And finally, thanks to all of you for listening. If you enjoyed this narrative-style episode and would like to hear more stories, let me know via email at brad@mentallyinvincible.com.